The Ocean Experiment, from Nautical Globalization to a General Ecology. Part 1. Globalization as a Maritime Experiment. If there were a copyright for single words, then the heirs of the Harvard economist and marketing theorist Theodore Levitt, 1925 to 2006, would have to be included among the richest families in the world. Since 1983, when Levitt, in an article for the Harvard Business Review, spoke for the first time about the quote-unquote globalization of markets, or, to put it better, when he unleashed a wave of imitators by employing this term, which had already been used on occasion, the word globalization has risen to become one of the most widely used terms in the modern lexicon. It is undoubtedly the most infectiously energetic word in the vocabulary of the past quarter of a century. This is really saying something in an age in which many terms have spread like epidemics throughout the world of discourse, especially ones such as terrorism, sustainability, greenhouse effect, precariat, celebrity, structured products, and the like. Furthermore, this term has a quasi-magical character. It has the power to produce what it names all by itself. It globalizes itself by creating a name for the most important occurrence of our time, the transformation of the world into a dynamic context in which almost everything interacts with almost everything else, almost everywhere. The market's transformation into a world, Weltwerdung, or the world's transformation into a market, as envisaged by Levitt, could not have taken place were it not sustained by a technological innovation that since the 1970s and 1980s has fundamentally transformed most of humanity's mode of existence. I am referring to the introduction of digital procedures into the communicative activities of civilizations. Thus, to begin with, we are completely justified in describing globalization as the digital revolution. Its hallmark is the incredible acceleration of communications that results from the alliance of digitalization and computerization. The world had previously always been characterized by relatively slow movement, significant distance, and cultural asynchronicity. It was only able to be transformed into a synchronous world whose agents mutually reach across great distances in real time, because computerized world communications made maximum speed into the standard symbolic transaction. Spatial distances seem to lose their meaning in a synchronous world. It's hard to avoid the impression that high-speed movements have made slow voyages a thing of the past. We do not really understand the essence of globalization if we allow ourselves to be dazzled by digital revolution's glittering surface. As much as dramatic as the changes to our modus vivendi may be, and as profoundly as the volatile financial markets of the last decade have shaped our understanding of the reality and unreality of monetary transactions, they still form but the surface layer of a multi-level transportation system, which is based on the interconnection of relatively slow flowing masses and quick signal transmissions. In the current phase of globalization, both poles are already inseparably intertwined, the massive and the subtle, heavy traffic and flying sparks, slow navigation of the surfaces of the Earth, and the transmission of messages via distance-negating transmission channels. From a systemic perspective, slow movements are still primary, since ultimately it is they alone that fill rapid transmissions of information with their substantive contents. From a historical perspective, this is especially true. Globalization is not only the effect of the most recent interaction between markets and digital technology. It is the result of a long history that began the moment when the sailors of the Iberian Peninsula, in the middle of the 15th century, were seized by the audacious idea that the Atlantic Ocean must have another shore, and that the shore could be reached. Viewed in terms of its origins, real and genuine globalization was thus initially a nautical fact. Globalization originally means nothing but the Atlanticization of seafaring. It implies the transition from coastal navigation in the Portuguese manner to navigation of the high seas, based on the model of Columbus's voyages. Globalization, therefore, presupposes belief in the spherical shape of the Earth. For this reason, it is not advisable to derive the word globalization from the adjective global, as is typical, but rather from the noun globe, the central cartographic medium of the modern world, which discloses to terrestrial inhabitants the truth about the shape of their planet and reveals the preponderance of the oceans. Globalization is based on the belief in the accessibility of other shores. Indeed, even more than this, it is nourished by the conviction that great fortunes are to be found on the other shore. The extreme risks of seafaring are only to be accepted because distant worlds are imagined as immense treasure troves, from which the successful entrepreneur returns to sea laden with riches. In short, the adventure of nautical globalization is only conceivable if we recall the beginnings of the modern world, when European sailors transitioned from cartographic theory to nautical praxis and dared to demonstrate the unity of the earth as a round, navigable space for transportation. It would not be appropriate here to discuss the psychosocial premises of the oceanic turn. All we know for sure is that there must have been something like a primitive accumulation of daring among human beings of the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries. The demographic policy of early European nation-states undoubtedly contributed to such an accumulation. In fact, Europe, today a region of the planet in demographic decline, was engulfed by a deliberate political population tsunami between the 16th and 19th centuries, whose consequences included a massive export of human beings. Research has shown how 50 million human beings then left behind what we now call the Old World, some voluntarily and some involuntarily, as merchant adventurers and as desperados. They did so to escape from misfortune, to seek a new fortune, most without the prospect of a return voyage. Not a few filled with the above-mentioned faith in the primacy of another shore. The world now belongs to the ambition of the second son. The Spanish called them the secundones, who leaves home to either find his fortune abroad or die trying. These brief remarks should be enough to illustrate the thesis that, from its nautical, mercantile and colonial beginnings, globalization has represented the inclusion of the entire Earth in the psychodynamics of the pursuit of happiness, or in the escape from local misery. It thus becomes evident that globalization is not merely a technological or political phenomenon, that it does not merely indicate the extension of international relations and the consolidation of economic networks, nor is it merely the addition of an informational and computerized superstructure to a nautical base. We can only really understand it if we recognize in it the expansionism of the pursuit of happiness. Turned unflinchingly outwards, this pursuit considers the entire globe to be its area of operations. Modernity as a whole is therefore based on a psychopolitical fact: the pursuit of happiness become planetary. Because becoming planetary in an operative sense means seafaring, as well as aviation since the second half of the 20th century, we today find nautical industries at the centre of events, as in the previous 5 centuries. One should not be confused by the media-savvy clamour of the information industry. The reality of reality is not found in a cyber cafe, nor is it defined in search engines. Its momentum in relatively slow transportation systems that make the spatial world accessible via roads, rail, and above all via maritime routes, on which activities devoted to seeking one's fortune motivate enterprising humans. Up to the present day, globalization remains bound to routines that were developed by early sailors to conduct the oceanic experiment. Part 2. The experimental spirit and the externalization of side effects. After a half-millennium of such practices, the time has come to review the established routines and to reconsider the experimental conditions as a whole. I have indicated why globalization is inseparable from oceanization, and at the same time have suggested that the adventure of modernity, which results in the integration of the Earth into progressively consolidated transportation networks, can only be rendered conceivable by the dynamism of the globalized pursuit of happiness. However, if globalization is oceanization, and if oceanization signifies the pursuit of happiness by nautical means, then it is evident that the reality of the global oceanic era of the pursuit of happiness must per se take on the form of an experiment, and the reasons why this had to happen are likewise clear. The term, quote-unquote, experiment, is obviously not only associated with procedures in laboratories and research institutes where scientists and engineers have more or less well-defined objects, quote-unquote, react to each other under controlled conditions to compel previously, quote-unquote, mute nature to speak. Nor can it be reduced to empirical modes of thought that are largely responsible for the material growth of knowledge in the modern world. First and foremost, the modus vivendi of human beings also now becomes experimental. Such human beings devote their whole existence, by land and by sea, to spotting new realities, new opportunities for profit, and new procedures for controlling nature. From this perspective, sailors, long-distance traders, ethnographers, naturalists, but also utopians, schemers, and perhaps charlatans and soldiers of fortune as well, should be included in the extended family of experimenters. Without the actions of such experimenters, the modern world would be unthinkable, beginning with the great figure of Francis Bacon, whom we remember as the author of the Novum Organon, and as founder of inductive logic, and whose death typified the risks of the experimental life. He died at the age of 65, following a cold that he had caught when, in the winter of 1626, he attempted to preserve meat by freezing it, instead of the more traditional method of salting it. In particular, he wanted to discover whether one could preserve gutted chickens by filling them with snow. Ultimately, the constitution of modern, quote-unquote, societies as a whole is experimental. Or, to put it better, the constitution of active populations who are surrounded by ever more numerous technological objects and engaged in ever closer interactions as they pursue ever more ambitious goals in ever more artificial environments is experimental. The conversion of the modern modus vivendi into experimental forms not only involved a dizzying acceleration of technological and cognitive progress, it also set off great cultural shockwaves, accompanied by enormous moral and political crises. These crises are partially discharged into conservative reactions, culminating in present-day fundamentalisms, and partly translated into totalitarian concepts of progress, climaxing in the idea of the quote-unquote permanent revolution, quoting Trotsky. Yet the most important result of the generalized experiment has only first dawned on current generations. It has become increasingly apparent that every experiment per se is continually accompanied by a systemic neglect of constraining conditions. This holds true for controlled scientific experiments, and it holds all the more true for the wild experiments that remain characteristic of modernity's modus vivendi on all fronts. One of the virtues of a well-constructed experiment, and one of the conditions for its success, is that it limits itself to a few precise isolated factors and studies their behaviour in a narrowly delimited test site. Hence, the art of ignoring is inseparable from successful experimentation. We could even say that the ability to disregard, Vernachlässigung, is what can be disregarded distinguishes the good experimenter, lege artis. However, if virtually all domains of life become experiments, in the world of work and in that of leisure, in communities as well as in private life, the consequences can easily be gauged. Every experimental zone engenders its own surroundings from disregarded variables. As a result, with the increasing consolidation of experiments, we always find that neglected zones, die Zonen der Vernachlässigung, increasingly overlap, with more or less severe consequences. In other words, precisely because the globalization of the pursuit of happiness leads to a widespread proliferation of experimental behaviour, it must also involve an inflation of negligence. Environmental awareness, as it has been articulated in the last third of the 20th century in the industrialised world, arises from the unbearable effects of this inflation. What we call the environment is initially nothing more than the disregarded variables in an experiment, which are only noticed after the fact. The obligation to take note of such things proceeds from the fact that negligence, in technical terms the externalization of apparently irrelevant factors, is everywhere reaching its limits. Side effects become ever more apparent and begin to overshadow the main effects. For this reason, disregarded variables must be combined with conscious and deliberate products. These latter not infrequently form the majority of the equation. Where externalization was, internalization shall be. The age of side effects, at the same time, represents an age of integral balances. We now understand that the globalization of happiness experiments cannot occur without the globalization of side effects. This is a morally demanding and economically costly realization, which has tragic implications in some instances. On the one hand, we are increasingly better able to recognize why and on what grounds modern agents devote themselves to enterprises that are supposed to convey them to their other shore. We see how each individual experimenter moves ahead in his or her own tunnel of chances by focusing on a few elements, namely costs and profits, and ignoring countless external factors. At the same time, it is more evident by the day that this modus operandi is no longer compatible with the fact that we coexist with billions of other experimenters pursuing their happiness on an interconnected globe. This was the great insight of the engineer Buckminster Fuller, who, in his visionary text, Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, 1968, called on us to finally compose a general codex for navigating the ship of all ships. His argument is as relevant today as it was when he first authored it. The vast majority of human beings have populated Spaceship Earth in both prehistoric and historic times without even noticing that they were on board a cosmic vehicle. Human beings started to form an idea of their actual situation when they began to voyage across oceans. Only today have conditions become such as to make the demand for a general policy of on-board management imperative. As long as human beings thought exclusively in local categories and acted in small and medium-sized radii, their existence was similar to that of ants on a Persian carpet. For all their eagerness to scurry around on it just as they wished, they remained unable to appreciate the carpet's pattern. From Buckminster Fuller's perspective, globalization primarily signifies an event in the history of thought, or, better, a reversal in the ethics of knowledge. Globalization is the rapid repeal of the right to ignorance. The evolutionary reserves of ignorance indulgence, which seem to place the earth forever at the disposal of its inhabitants, will run out within a few centuries. Ever since enterprising humans began acting on a global scale, they ventured into an era in which the only thing that will be of any help to them is to deal perceptively with circumstances on board the great ship. That includes in particular the recognition that in all too many ways they do not know enough to be able to act reasonably and without causing further harm. Part 3. Limits of externalization, or a new labour of the Argonauts. Interiorization must take the place of exteriorization. This is the axiom for the future realism in the globalized world. This has quite astonishing, even alarming consequences as regards the ocean, that primordial element. In every image of the world hitherto, the high seas, insofar as they already played a role for land-based cultures, epitomised an insurmountable externality. Even the fact that oceans have been navigable for centuries has hardly changed this view. Indeed, universal seafaring initially only seemed to prove what little consequence human activities have in the face of the supremacy of the elements. So it is no wonder if in the modern world all negligence flows into the sea, as used to be said of rivers. Over the last few decades, the observations of sailors and scientists at institutes of oceanography and marine biology from around the world have combined to form an alarming picture. I will mention only the most well-known phenomena: the great garbage patches of the North Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, a few of which have already become as large as Central Europe, and whose impact on the maritime environment has yet to be reliably gauged. The increasing acidity in the oceans, which, assuming ongoing business as usual by humans until the end of the 21st century, will no longer be compatible with numerous maritime life forms. A dramatic reduction of marine fauna, threatened by decades of industrialized overfishing, the growing risk of submarine oil spills due to increased offshore drilling, the polluting of the atmosphere above the oceans by the emissions of marine engines powered by heavy fuel oil, the contamination of enormous bodies of water through extensive aquafarming, the chronic polluting of oceans from the runoff of countless coastal cities and the refuse dumped from on board more than 100,000 ships which continually navigate the oceans, only a small number of which, namely cruise ships, have self-contained waste management systems. This list could be extended. The gravity of globalization is palpable at every single point. The sea can no longer fulfill its supposed role as absorber of disregarded factors of human experiments. The absolute imperative of the future requires that transactions on the seas and coast become civilized. Civilization means the integration of an external world into an internal world, the subsumption of disorderly praxis into a regulated sphere, and the subordination of a field in which irresponsible actions have prevailed to the jurisdiction of an authority capable of acting responsibly. It would be delusional to expect the imperative of civilization to be realized solely on a voluntary basis. For its implementation, two mechanisms, or objective trends, are necessary, in the absence of which goodwill alone remains powerless. First, in view of existing calamities and those to come, the agents in question will have to mutually compel each other to finally submit to a universally binding set of rules whose introduction and oversight is the vital business of an organ of global governance. Second, technological developments will have to occur that ensure that the civilization of maritime practices happens at a reasonable price. The synergy of law, science, and technology will be necessary for the civilization of globalization to succeed. In the final analysis, all legal and technological contributions to the civilization of globalization will remain merely superficial modifications if they are not properly embedded in a comprehensive transformation of the moral and spiritual forces that drive globalization. Such a transformation would have to assume the proportions of a cultural revolution. It would involve civilizing the pursuit of happiness itself. I have indicated how the mundane pursuit of happiness, symptomatically embodied by Columbus's legendary obsession with gold, has provided the motive of motives, the motor of motors, the energy of energies that we see at work from the beginning of seafaring, globalization and modernity in the 15th century. The dream of finding good fortune on another shore has driven the world experiment of modern enterprising cultures. For some time now there have been indications that this dream is transitioning into another mode, if it is not already exhausted. I would like to mention two such indications. We find the first in outer space, just above Earth, that is, in a region that in more naive times used to be called the heavens. Since 1998, the International Space Station has been under development as a joint effort of America's NASA and Russia's Roscosmos, as well as the space travel agencies of Europe, Canada and Japan. Since the year 2000, 220 people have stayed on board the station for various lengths of time. This group can be considered an elite of present-day humanity, insofar as they presently comprise the only members of our species who, owing to their eccentric observational position, have seen spaceship Earth in situ with their own eyes. During one of the station's orbital periods of 92 minutes, astronauts experience no less than 16 Earth rises and Earth sets every day. The small group's privilege of observing such a spectacle immediately leads to a radical transformation of our image of the world. Whereas modern humans believe in the possibility of finding a fortune on another shore and plunge headlong into the tunnel of their search, disregarding all other aspects, observers in the space station have taken up the standpoint that immediately allows them to see that there can be no other shore for the Earth as a whole. One could say that they travel into space as modern humans and return as postmodern humans, insofar as postmodernism is defined as a mode of thought that fundamentally requires giving up the illusion of the other shore. For the time being, conventional inhabitants of the Earth's surface remain modern, which means that they revert to the position of ants on the carpet that fail to appreciate the pattern, even though attempts to explain it to them are not lacking. Reference to the astronautical change of perspectives can be completed by a second observation. One of the most fascinating phenomena on today's oceans is the emergence of a cruise industry over the last 30 years. Some experts declare it to be the surprising rebirth of aristocratic travel in the age of mass tourism. According to insiders, there are currently about 1 million human beings on board cruise ships at any given time. There is reason to believe that even these travellers should have considered to be a group of postmoderns, since in their own way they've dispelled the illusion of another shore, at least for the duration of their cruise. They intuitively understand why being underway is the goal itself, and why their happiness is to be found on board or nowhere at all. Incidentally, environmental awareness is unusually more developed in this group of passengers and in those who operate ships. Indeed, if one may believe this industry's self-image, the facilities that are characteristic of this class of ships form a technological avant-garde of maritime environmentalism. The spokespersons for the industry to some extent speak as realists, and to some extent still as prophets, when they assure us that sea voyages are no longer the problem, but are instead the solution, due to the legal and technological standards that the industry has voluntarily adopted. I would like to conclude by recalling the voyage of the Argonauts, the most ancient seafaring adventure in the European tradition, which was already sung of in pre-Homeric times, and that again became the subject of great epic poem by Apollonius of Rhodes, a librarian and writer of the Hellenistic era, having stolen the golden fleece in far-off Colchos, present-day Georgia, with the help of the king's daughter, Medea. The daring soldiers find themselves in a difficult situation as they return home, which almost results in the end of their enterprise. Zeus is angered and sends an unfavourable wind, which causes the Argo to run aground on the shoal of Syrtis Major on the Libyan coast, without any hope of returning to open sea. For days the heroes are stuck on the shoal and see their end fast approaching. There, the local tutelary deity appears to the desperate Jason with the mysterious command, quote, "Do ye pay to your mother a recompense for all her travail when she bare you so long in her womb?" End quote. Jason seeks out the counsel of his companions, and finally the hero Peleus solves the riddle. The Argonauts have been ordered to lift their ship into the air and carry it across land. In fact, we would expect the Son of Kings to think themselves too exalted to perform a labour that one would not ask of slaves. Full of admiration, the poet turns to the men of days gone by, quote, By your might and your valour ye have raised high aloft on your shoulders the ship, and all that ye have brought therein, and bear her 12 days and nights alike over the desert sands of Libya." End quote. In this tale, we for the first time encounter the figure of reversal between passenger and vessel, between bearer and what is borne, between environment and inhabitant. One can glean from this first indication that ships, and environments in general, can no longer be regarded merely as maternal containers that protect and care for us under all conditions. As soon as human beings run aground on the shoals of false social or technological evolution, they must learn to repair their ships, their systems, their institutions for use outside, even if they cannot take them on their shoulders and carry them through the desert. We are not going to carry a ship for 12 days over the dunes. Argonauts today will have to struggle through the entire 21st century so that the ocean experiment will once more run its course successfully through all dangers.